let's just get right to the crux of it. So are you transphobic?
Depends who you ask.
I'm asking you.
I have so many friends who are trans.
You do?
I do, yeah.
Really? Like
quite a few.
When you say friends, like what does that mean? I think in essence we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, if that's what they mean, but
right, if that's what they mean.
But I tend to interrogate people, and they mean something.
What's the difference? I don't understand the difference.
Because you would otherwise,
if your neurology is telling you something's wrong, like that's in your brain.
Yeah, but
all right, we're recording. So Colin, thanks for joining.
Good to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And like I was saying before we started recording, what I'm trying to do with this show, I'm realizing is have good faith discussion and debate with people about different issues, whether I am or I'm not an expert on them. Because I do believe that most people like yourself, if they believe something that I disagree with, it's you're thinking these things in good faith, and they deserve to be debated in good faith. So
I'd like to think that I try to engage in as good a faith as possible, and it's why it's been so aggravating for me to deal with a lot of the gender activist side of things, because it's just complete insanity in some part of it. There's a few people you can talk to, but oh man, it's just straight character assassination most of the time. But
tell me more about that, and I promise I will get to the questions and stuff that I have. But tell me a little bit more about your experience with that first.
Yeah, so I don't know how much you know about how I started talking about these issues or anything, but it was, so I started hearing a lot of stuff about gender and people saying that, mainly when they were making claims about the biology of sex. I've had colleagues, I was in graduate school at the time, and they were saying things like, there's 5 sexes maybe, or sex is a spectrum, or it's a total social construct. There's even, sex isn't even a thing we can, draw lines around. And I started, at first I thought, well, maybe they're confusing sex and sort of, gender expression or something like that. And as I dug more, it's like, no, they're actually talking about biology. And I was in biology and I studied evolutionary behavioral ecology. So I knew what sex was, because it's like the biggest variable that tells the differences between how organisms act within a species. And you can make predictions across species too, knowing just a very simple fact, like what sex are they, what the size of the gamete they're making. And so I stayed quiet for a little while, because every time I tried to broach the topic and just sort of, not online, but just friend groups, man, the pushback was really bad. It wasn't, they never gave any sort of argument. It was just immediate to your parroting right-wing talking points. This is very transphobic. You can't say this. And so eventually I got fed up with it. And it's because I had kind of a history of debunking things. Like, I used to have a blog where I debunked creationism, intelligent design. And I was always into the science because I cared about what's true. And I thought being an academic scientist was the place where you could say the most true things about biology, and you're paid to say the most true things about biology. And then, I realized I couldn't say what I wanted to say, or I eventually wrote an article that was eventually published in Quillette. And my advisors and mentors told me this isn't something I should publish, after they told me it was totally right and an important piece and it was written extremely well. And it's just like, well, what am I doing in biology if you're saying this is correct, the biology is right, but I can't publish it? So it made me realize that academia maybe wasn't the environment for me if I'm discouraged from saying true things about biology, only on topics that sort of the left agrees with, about certain things like, like the gender, sex, biology stuff. I could criticize intelligent design and creationism, 8 days a week, and no one cares about that because the polarization in academia. I eventually published more articles after that. There was a big backlash. I published some articles in the Wall Street Journal. That led to a huge backlash. It led to a big cancellation attempt for people, because I was also on the job market. I graduated at that point, and I was looking for professor jobs. Activists were posting on the big job boards that I was like a race scientist and a transphobe. And
what was the message you were standing behind that was getting you canceled?
It's so stupid. Even it's like all these articles, like the first article in the Wall Street Journal, it was called "The Dangerous Denial of Sex," and it just defended the idea that sex, being male or female, these are real categories in nature. These aren't social constructs. They actually describe real things, real discrete categories that almost everybody falls into, and that it's socially important in certain contexts, like for women's rights and women's spaces. It's important for, it undermines a lot of what the LGBT community was involved in, because if you're redefining what it means to be gay or straight along someone's gender identity instead of their sex, then, well, what does it even mean to be gay anymore? And then also with the whole gender affirming care, like they had this idea that, well, sex isn't a real thing. It's a statistical thing. We can change body parts. We can literally change your sex. And like, that's just a false premise. I think you shouldn't be building medical interventions on. And so it was just covering those things. Wasn't about trans people in general. It was just saying biology is real, sex is real, and it's also important in some contexts that we need to track. That was the extent.
Let's just get right to the crux of it. So are you transphobic?
Depends who you ask.
I'm asking you.
No, I'm.
Yeah.
I'm coming from a place.
How do you feel about trans people? Would you have a trans friend? Would you be friends with someone?
I have many friends who are. I have so many friends who are trans.
You do?
I do. Yeah.
Really? Like
quite a few.
When you say friends, like what does that mean? You see them once a month? How close are you?
Not many who live around me in Nashville, but I go to conferences all the time. People who I was introduced to on social media, who when we go out, see them at conferences, we all go out, hang out, get drinks. I hired a trans woman, was the first employee on my Substack as an assistant editor.
So
we're still good friends today.
With trans people, like you have respectful, mutual, two-way relations with trans people. Where if I brought them on, they'd say, "Yeah, Colin Wright is a cool guy. I like him, I trust him, I respect him, he respects me." That kind of thing.
I would for sure. Like my friend Buck Angel, I don't know if you know who that is, but he's just one of my favorite people in the world. Like of all people, he's not just my favorite trans person. He's just like one of my favorite genuine, pure humans that I want to be around. He's just the best guy ever.
Yeah.
And I have no problem using he, him pronouns for Buck. I for my friends, I extend that, that courtesy to them. And so I just have no problem with it. I'm coming from a place on the left. I'm very pro gay rights, pro gay marriage. I treat people as individuals as much as I can. And that includes trans people who identify as whatever, with the way they express and everything. I have no hatred for any of these people.
Do you ever get into arguments with them? You talk about stuff like your points about the binary nature of sex, or gender versus sex, or gender ideology, or trans and women's sports, or any of these hot topics that you've been a part of. Like, do you ever get into debates with your trans friends?
So the trans people who I'm friends with tend not to be the sort of woke ideologues, because they tend not to want to be my friend. And so the people I talk to, who I consider my friends, like Sarah Higdon, a Buck Angel, and the Blair Whites of the world, and others. I just spoke to Brianna Wu this morning. We had a good long chat with each other, and we disagreed on certain things, but we had a really good, friendly conversation, and I count her as a friend now. We'll disagree on certain things, but usually we don't actually disagree on anything, because they're not coming at their trans identity from an ideological perspective. They're just sort of, I took medical steps, interventions to make my body appear as the opposite sex because it helps me move through the world in a way that I feel more comfortable with. They're not fed ideas that, like, you're a boy trapped in a, girl's body or that type of thing. They're fully cognizant of what sex they are. And to them, that's just like, well, that's what it means to be a trans woman. I'm a male who identifies and appears and tries to move through the world as a woman. Mm-hmm. But they're like, but I clearly can't change sex. Like Buck Angel is someone who will just tell you, like, I'm still like literally a woman, even though I look like a man. And I'm comfortable with that. I don't need to deny biological facts in order to live my best life, type of thing.
To what extent is the disagreement therefore a semantic disagreement versus a true material disagreement? What I mean by that is that if you are supportive of trans people's right to be trans and you respect them, And is your disagreement therefore about the semantics of whether they're, technically changing their sex or gender or not? Because I would have to imagine that like the core issue, like what we should care about, are the opportunities and rights and things that trans people can do in our society and with their body. And if a trans person can be respected and become trans, and is like, sorry, let me not ramble on, but is it a semantic argument that you have, or is it a material one, given that you ultimately do support trans people?
There is a distinct material difference in the way that the sort of trans activists view the world, versus what I would say the old school transsexuals like the Buck Angels and the Brianna Wu's of the world view what it means to be trans. And I have no problem with anyone taking on some identity and whatever they want. Like, I don't care. People can do whatever they want. The issue I take is with the ideological component that's sort of arisen in the last, probably is 20 years old, but it's really taken root in the last 10 years. Is this idea that whether you're a boy or a girl or a man or a woman is all about your identity, how one identifies, instead of have anything to do with biology. That sex is a social construct, that you're assigned a sex at birth, and it's just based on a statistical look at an individual, that you can change your sex.
What would Brianna Wu say to these things? Like, doesn't Brianna Wu or these other people you mentioned believe that they have in fact changed their sex?
No, they don't believe that at all. I just spoke to Brianna this morning, and we talked just about that as a component of it. So the ideology they have, this, it's kind of a two-tiered ideology, and I'm writing expert court cases on this. I get to see what the experts on the other side are arguing in court on this. And it's completely nuts. So they think, and this is, you can look in like the back of the glossary of like WPATH's Standards of Care 8, where they lay out what they mean by these terms. They have this idea of the gender binary, and this is distinct from the sex binary we'll talk about. And that the gender binary has to do with like the social roles and stereotypes that are sort of, that people are pressured into based on their perceived sex. Okay, you can think about like the paragon masculinity and this paragon idea, Platonic form of femininity. Those are what they call the gender binary. Okay. And then they have what's called the sex binary. And I would argue this has to do with being sperm or ova, what you have the function to produce. They don't see it that way. They view sex as a social construct that's based on a sort of statistical accumulation of various traits that they code as being male or female. And so they wouldn't say that anyone is actually male or female. They have textbooks that say sex isn't a property of a body, it's a property of individual traits. Mm-hmm. And once you go that route, then they say like, well, all these individual traits, like your voice pitch, your facial hair, your breast development, how much your fat distribution on your body, the way your genitals look, well, those can all be changed with hormones and surgeries. Therefore, you can literally change those, and by doing so, statistically move someone along the sex spectrum to a point that will match their gender identity, which is just where you sit in your own mind based on your perception of stereotypes of masculinity or femininity. So you can be a tomboy. Let's say you're a female, you're a tomboy. Your sex would be, far towards the female side of the sex spectrum, but your gender identity would be somewhere kind of more towards the middle because you're kind of tomboyish. You have maybe more rough and tumble play.
Yeah.
And they would perceive that as to mean that you have a mismatch between your gender identity and the sex that you were assigned.
And I asked this question about Brianna Wu. Yeah. I actually don't know a bunch about them. You said that Brianna Wu, what does Brianna Wu identify as?
As a trans woman.
So Brianna Wu does identify as a trans woman. So she does it. And what was Brianna Wu born as?
Brianna Wu is biologically male.
But she does identify as a woman.
As a woman in terms of sort of the social roles,
right?
Sort of stereotype, like very feminine from a very young age, always felt that, like she was born in the wrong body, had the dysphoria, the anxiety, the strong desire from, as soon as she could even think about it, to want to be a female.
So how do you feel about that? So I thought 5 minutes ago you said she does not identify. I thought you said she does not identify as a woman. She identifies as a man. I thought you said
she recognizes that she's biologically male.
Right. But do you have a problem with her identifying as a woman?
No, I don't have a problem with Brianna identifying as a woman. If Brianna tried to use that identity to try to compete in women's sports, I might say, well, you shouldn't be doing that, because from the male biology, you have a disadvantage. So if someone is just straight up identifying as something, I don't care. But there are certain contexts where it actually does matter. We can't grant someone, everything that comes along with being a woman and ignore, situations where these spaces or sports categories were created specifically to control for sex and not how someone identifies.
I might be. I want to just make sure I understand your views. So, I might be just misinformed. Do you have a problem with let's say you have someone that's born a man who transitions and becomes a transgender woman? Do you have a problem with that person identifying as a woman? Because I thought what you were saying earlier about sex being binary, this is why I think there might be a semantic argument here. Because if you're okay with someone transitioning and identifying as a woman, then what's the disagreement?
The disagreement is on what is granted on top of that. Is it full legal rights as a woman? Is it right to compete in female sports and go to female prisons if you're convicted of a crime? In the very few areas in society where sex actually matters, in most contexts, like if you're getting hired for a job or whatever, sex really shouldn't matter. We shouldn't discriminate based on sex. But there are certain areas in society where, we have separate spaces or categories to control specifically for these sex differences. And so it makes sense to not, to be tracking sex in these contexts rather than suddenly just switching to gender identity, because then sex doesn't seem to matter. And then also in instances where someone like the tomboy I said, if WPATH defines someone who's trans as someone whose gender identity or expression differs from what is traditionally associated with their sex, then a tomboy is trans by definition. So a girl who cuts their hair short is trans by definition. And this isn't just an innocuous way to categorize someone, because this means that you have a mismatch between your gender identity and your sex. And then there's a whole medical apparatus that swings into this that says, well, we can fix you. We can fix this mismatch in your body by changing your physical features to match your brain. Even though I would just say that,
but some people should undergo gender transformation, right?
It depends. I think there are certain individuals it makes more sense to, in like the Brianna Wu's, the Buck Angels, back in a time when there was actually medical safeguarding around these things, where it wasn't just, you can consent to these things, you get signed up for a mastectomy or whatever, or a phalloplasty. Just you can get doctor's notes to sign these things. It's ridiculous how much you can just, over the counter testosterone in less than 30 minutes sometimes for some clinics. There's absolutely no safeguards on what you can do that's covered by insurance under this being medically necessary life-saving care. I'm mainly concerned with the minors, the kids who are being transitioned in this way, because one, I think the premise of this gender affirming care is rooted in pseudoscience, is rooted in this false notion that you have a mismatch between your gender identity and your sex. If your behavior doesn't match what's typically associated with being a boy or a girl, I would just say you have feminine men and masculine women. Like, there's nothing wrong with you. There's no mismatch. You're a whole and complete person. We shouldn't be telling kids that because you're a girl who likes other girls, or who likes rough and tumble play, or a boy who likes playing with dolls, that there's a mismatch going on in your brain, and that this can be solved, because there's nothing to actually solve.
When should people undergo gender transformation? And I'm sure that you think that sometimes they should, right? Because you have friends who are transgender. You mentioned a couple of them. So certainly there are cases when you would agree people should undergo sex gender transformation? When do you think that's the proper thing to do?
So I would never tell someone that you should or you shouldn't. I think that's ultimately going to be like a personal decision for somebody, because I think there probably are ways that a good life can be lived without doing that. It's going to be based on the individual. Is this something that they've had from a very long time, from infancy, is causing them insane distress? Are they delusional or not about their actual sex? Are they falling for an ideology that is telling them that there's a mismatch and that they need to be fixed because maybe they're bullied because they're a feminine man or
what
a
about
masculine
the people,
woman?
But the people that you mentioned, the friends you mentioned, the names you mentioned, those are people who are internally feel like they're the other gender, and therefore you would agree with their decision that to transition, right?
I would support their decision. I don't know if I would say, oh, you should do this. I would say, it's your decision. I would be supportive of them. It's their right to do it if they want to, when they're adults and they have all the information available to them about the risks of the procedures, and making sure they're fully informed that you're not actually changing your sex. These are just purely cosmetic changes you're making. And I think for some people it can be beneficial, but it's hard to know until after it happens, because there's kind of no going back, and there are people who regret doing it, but there are some people like the Buck Angels and the Brianna Woos who are thriving, and they will tell you that it saved their life, that they were miserable and they would have almost certainly committed suicide if they weren't able to do it. And I don't. I'm glad that they're so happy doing what they're doing, and I think probably they are happier because they did it. Yeah.
So you agree that? So you don't have. So there are some people who have kind of a dogmatic on either end of the spectrum who are dogmatic, and you have people who are who are critical of gender transitions, to say that they don't think anyone should do it. It sounds like you are not dogmatic. You believe that there are cases when people really, it's in their best interest to undergo a gender transformation because to not doing so can be legitimately life-threatening, right? It sounds like you agree with that.
Yeah. No, it could be. I believe that some people do benefit from it. What's really difficult, though, is that because some people do benefit, and you get a lot of people, say older trans women, who weren't allowed to, they went through puberty, and a lot of them have regret. They're like, oh man, I wish I could have, had my puberty stopped earlier so I would pass better now, because now I'm still happy as a trans woman, but man, I don't pass very well. This has spurred like this hunt for the kids, and making sure that like we find these kids who will grow up to be trans and who won't regret it. But the issue is that it's impossible to know at a young age which individuals will actually persist through puberty and still maintain this gender identity.
Yeah.
And so my main thing is really halting the brakes on the pediatric gender affirming care. One, because there's no good evidence that it actually is beneficial for these kids, because it's a whole new cohort of kids who are suddenly, without a history of gender nonconformity or a interest in being the other sex, are falling for this ideology that says, oh, I'm kind of, maybe I'm a tomboy and I don't identify this, or I don't identify with these crazy stereotypes of hypermasculine or feminine, so I'm non-binary. I fall in the middle on this gender identity spectrum, and that this means that I need to maybe block my puberty or get on cross-sex hormones or have a mastectomy. So I'm focused more on the pediatric gender stuff. I don't think any kids should transition whatsoever.
But you're cool with adults doing it, because I think that's an important distinction. If there are people who characterize you as Colin Wright, the anti-trans guy, it sounds like you're not the anti-trans guy. Your issue is with kids transitioning and not with adults. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. And I'm also interested, if adults do transition, I think they need to do so with being totally informed. Like, it's still bad if they're feeding adults pseudoscience and false ideas about biology that's causing them to transition. I want to make sure that anyone who's choosing to do this as an adult is fully informed about what they're actually doing to their bodies. And then there's other questions on, should this be done in this idea that it's life-saving, it's medical, or should this just be something that you pay for out of pocket? Less like a woman who wants to get a breast augmentation. I mean, there's plenty of people who want to change their bodies. Is this something that should be
Well, there's research
paid for
that
private?
there's research, as I think you mentioned, that it can be life threatening to not transition if you are, if you're meant to transition.
I think it can be for certain individuals, but there really isn't like really good, robust, like long-term data on this for even adults, and it's really difficult to know like, which ones are gonna persist, and 20 years out, how they're gonna feel about themselves. So, there's a lot of people who feel anxiety about women who have small breasts and feel anxiety about that and would benefit, maybe be less depressed if they got breast implants. But is this what we want to do? We want to pay for people to do this? Because right now it's literally just you walk in there, you say that you have a gender identity that doesn't match your sex, and it's just you get offered basically any type of surgery that you want to. And this is something, I mean, I worked with a mom, published her account on my Substack, and sending me all the stuff. She was, I think, a 57-year-old woman who just received like a message from her hospital saying that they're updating their, if you have different pronouns, make sure you can update your medical records. We'll do it for you. And she was just kind of playing along and said like, oh, well, what are non-binary pronouns? And they said, well, if you don't identify totally as a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. Mm-hmm. And so she was like, well, I'm kind of sporty. Maybe I should change my pronouns to they, them. And they let her do it. And then she came back a month later and was like, you know what? I've been thinking more about this. I'd like to maybe get my breast removed because I play a lot of sports and it's just kind of boyish.
Well, that's not life threatening. I mean, look,
it wasn't life threatening, but I mean, but she was able to get approved for a mastectomy and a phalloplasty in just months, even though, there was no roadblocks for whatsoever for this.
It sounds like you're skeptical about whether it's dangerous for a trans person to transition out of medical necessity. I just pulled up a couple things. So there's the 2019 U.S. Transgender Survey done by the National Center for Transgender Equality, which shows that 40% of transgender adults reported having attempted suicide at some point in their lives. Compare that with 4.6 of the general population. The Trevor Project in 2022.
So there are issues. So there's difference between like attempted suicide and difference between that and like actually completed suicide.
I mean, I pulled up, I have like a couple dozen research. The point, I mean, I could go through each of these, and I'm happy to if you're skeptical of it. But the research that I have in front of me shows that it is demonstrably serious and life threatening for a trans person to not transition. Is it the data that you're disagreeing with? Or what do you
there is a lot of data is really poor on these. Just like so the idea that 40% are attempting.
There would have to be a conspiracy, because I'm talking about Transgender Survey, Trevor Project, American Academy of Pediatrics, JAMA Psychiatry, International. There would have to be like a widespread conspiracy for all of these sources to be conspiring to force people to transition. I mean, what do you make of that?
I think you would be completely shocked by behind the scenes of the type of research that is getting published in a lot of these journals that are done by what I view are very activist researchers who are, publishing studies where they look at they measure a diminishment in dysphoria after chest surgery by giving them the same test before and after, saying like, okay, your breasts are removed now. How much dysphoria are your breasts giving you? Well, it's just like, well, you don't have any breasts to be dysphoric about anymore. And so like, there are so many studies that they're set up in a way where like the answers are kind of forced, the conclusions are forced. Mm-hmm. Or they'll have extremely short follow-up times between like after they're doing this, when they're still in like a honeymoon period of the type of surgeries they have. I mean, so the completed suicides versus suicidal ideation, these are huge problems with these studies. And also, comparing these suicide rates or suicidal ideation to the general population. And there have been studies where they do the correct comparison, which is comparing people with these who have trans identities to other people who have similar other mental health issues, because there's so many co-occurring comorbidities that come with gender dysphoria. And when you compare it to like similarly people with similar mental illness, then like the difference goes away in a lot of these cases.
I mean, I'm sure we could find some of these studies that aren't done perfectly, But what other area of life, or would you or I want to be so critical as to try to sweep aside? I'm talking about like dozens of research. So let me just read through a couple of these, just like the titles. So there's the U.S. Transgender Survey, there's the Trevor Project, there's the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's JAMA Psychiatry, there's International Journal of Health Study, there's Family Acceptance Project, there's a Williams Institute. So there's dozens of studies across dozens of countries, across dozens of years that are saying that people that need a transition that don't, it's a life-threatening issue. And I'm sure you can pick at a couple of these surveys and prove to me that they're biased, but why do we have to be so critical and assume there's a giant conspiracy? There's just no way that you could have dozens of research papers, dozens of countries, dozens of years that are all conspiring against the truth.
Yeah.
When I think you've admitted there are cases where people can have suicidal ideation for not transitioning. All I'm saying is that, like, if someone really needs to transition because they're of a different gender than they, like maybe your friends that you mentioned, if they don't do that, there's a lot of data to support that they could be, that's not good for them. That's really dangerous, right?
Yeah. So there is better evidence, and I will admit that there is, for some individuals who are, that were transitioned before we had this new cohort, the rapid onset gender dysphoria cohort. In older transsexuals, most of these people transitioned later in life. They weren't minors when they transitioned. But there is evidence that this is much more beneficial for this cohort. People who, from an extraordinarily young age, felt this deep-seated feeling that they were born in the wrong body and that they needed to transition. And then that feeling made it through puberty as well. Those individuals are most likely never going to not identify with, to desist from their trans identity. And there is evidence that it could be that transitioning and making these procedures is beneficial for them. A major problem that's done in the research, and it's rampant, is a lot of researchers fail to distinguish between this older cohort of where there is evidence of benefit and this much newer, what I would call sort of this ideological cohort, the rapid onset gender dysphoria, where they didn't have this dysphoria from an extraordinarily young age. They're just, 11, 12, 13, they're coming out to their parents saying, I'm non-binary, I'm trans, I'm actually a boy in a girl's body. And a lot of researchers use data from this older cohort and be like, well, we have plenty of evidence that it's beneficial, but they're totally ignoring that this new cohort has almost nothing in common with the protocols that were made for the older cohort, where there is some evidence of benefit. And so this is sort of what we're up against. And that's why I mainly am trying to focus on this younger cohort of people who are identifying as trans, because they bear almost no resemblance to sort of the Brianna Woos and the Buck Angels of those generations who identified as transsexuals, who could have some benefit.
Are you familiar with the Trevor Project in 2022?
I'm familiar with the Trevor Project. What happened?
So the survey, that's the survey of LGBTQ youth, including transgender youth, found that 52% of trans and non-binary youth seriously considered suicide. Those who were able to access gender-affirming care had lower rates of suicide. What do you make of that?
Again, they're comparing kids who identify as trans to the general population. They need to compare that to kids who have similar levels of anxiety and depression who don't identify as trans. Okay, because they're more at risk, but if you identify as trans, being trans is usually not something that is just by itself. Usually these trans identities come out of a kid who is extremely depressed, who has extreme social anxiety.
But it's saying the gender-affirming care made it better. It's saying the gender-affirming care made their symptoms better.
It said that their suicidal ideation went down, that they thought less about suicide. But again, if you look at the actual completed suicides and you compare that to kids who aren't trans, who have similar levels of mental health issues, they don't commit suicide at any different level. There's no evidence that it's the actual gender affirming care that's doing it, because the kids who have similar bad mental health problems, they're not having similar suicide. They have similar suicide rates to the kids who.
Let me make sure I'm following. Maybe I'm missing something here. I'm saying if there's a high percentage rate of suicidal ideation and that goes down because of gender affirming care, you're saying that other groups of teens also have high. What am I missing? Like, why is it not good to bring? What am I missing?
Well, one, because
Why is it
it's
not
not
good to
actually
bring that number down?
well, it's not decreasing actual suicide rates.
Isn't suicide ideation totally tied to causally tied to rates of suicide?
Not in these populations. So when you actually look at like the completed suicides, you don't find any difference in the trans populations compared to people with similar mental health issues, similar levels of depression and anxiety.
That's interesting. Can I dive into one of your fundamental views that we didn't get to talk about yet, which is the notion that biological sex is binary? So let me just kind of paraphrase what I think your views are.
This is what I talk about mostly, probably.
Yeah. So let me try to paraphrase what I believe your view is and just edit anything I say. Your view, Colin, is that biological sex is strictly binary, so male female, based on your reproductive anatomy. The counter argument to this, critics have pointed out that sex can be more complex with DSDs and intersex individuals, challenging that binary model. And these critics will argue that sex is on a spectrum due to chromosomal, hormonal, and anatomical variations. And in fact, some researchers and activists have claimed that focusing just on like the reproduction overlooks the full range given those other variables. So what do you make of those other cases? Do you just consider them outliers, or what's your response to that?
So it's important to understand what biologists mean when we say sex is binary, because the way that a lot of, I guess, activists would try to portray it is that I'm saying that every human who's ever existed, ever exists, who currently exists, and ever will exist, is either male or female. That is not what I mean when I talk about when I say sex is binary. What sex is binary means, when you distill it down, it means that there are only two sexes. It doesn't say that everybody has a sex. Okay? So sex is defined by the type of gamete you have the function to produce, and there's caveats there about, you don't actually need to have functional gonads in order for them to have a function. Just as you have, if your car breaks down, your car still has a function of transportation, even though it's not currently functioning. But a sex is a phenotype. It is an outgrowth of development. It is a product of development. And because of that, there are certain individuals where development gets really messed up, who I don't think we can clearly identify as either male or female. But then importantly, well, one, this is an extraordinarily rare anomaly. And two, sex ambiguity is not a third sex, because it's not another type of reproductive strategy. So if to any individual who has a sex, it's going to be male or female. If you can talk about, like, if you look at hermaphrodites in nature, like garden snails, they're hermaphrodites. They're producing both large gametes and small gametes. You'd be like, oh, doesn't this defeat the whole sex binary thing? It's like, well, no, because they're both male and female. They're harboring those two sexes into one. So sex is binary. We're using the term binary as the second sort of dictionary definition, which is composed of two parts, like a binary compound in chemistry or a binary star system. There's only two of these things. It says nothing about, we don't think bodies are binary. Clearly, the other downstream effects of sex, downstream consequences of sex, like height and voice pitch and preferences and behaviors, clearly not binary. You could say they're bimodal. There's average differences, but you can get really tall women and really short men. So the sex itself is binary. Bodies are not binary. Hopefully that clarifies something.
Got it.
At least my views on it.
Well, let's move on to the gender conversation. So your idea that gender should align with biological sex, I'm going to, again, try to paraphrase what I understand about your view, and just please
I'm not sure
edit.
Okay, go ahead. I'll wait till...
Oh, sorry. Please, what were you going to say?
The idea that I think gender should align with biological sex.
Is that not true?
It would totally depend on how you define gender, I suppose.
So actually, rather than me paraphrasing, tell me your views about the degree to which gender should align with biological sex. Is it the case that you think of gender as a social construct which should correspond closely to biological sex? I was under the impression that you argued against the idea that gender identity can be completely fluid, right? I thought you had expressed concern that detaching gender from biology could lead to social confusion and harms. Is that accurate or no?
So I have a big problem with the term gender identity. I think that is just an incredibly loaded term, and I think that is like a pseudoscientific term to say gender identity, because really, when it comes down to it, people try to say like your gender identity, like everyone has one. It's this fundamental thing about you, but really, when you look at how they're defining gender and stuff, it's basically just your self-assessment of how much you conform or don't conform to the norms associated with masculine or femininity, like those. And so like I could say that, you know, I'm on the masculine side. There are certain things that I like that maybe would be more feminine, but statistically, I'm not Randy Macho Man Savage masculine, but like, I like whiskey. I have a riding lawnmower. I like watching sports occasionally and MMA. So yeah, I'm kind of more that direction, but I don't identify as a man. I don't know what that means. I just am male, and I recognize the fact that I'm male, and then I just behave how I just express myself, however I internally feel. Um, I don't think everyone has a gender identity. I think it's almost a meaningless term. And so, but what I don't believe is I don't think that everyone should conform to social stereotypes associated, typically associated with their sex. I think if a man wants to wear a dress, if they want to be feminine, they should. If women want to wear combat boots and have short hair and whatever they can, men should be able to paint their nails. So I don't think your sex should align with what maybe someone call gender expression. Um, or the social norms. If you don't want to be a stay at home mom, don't be stay at home. If you don't want kids, don't have kids. Basically all that stuff. I just
Yeah.
have a problem with gender. I don't have my own definition for
Mhm.
gender, because it's so loaded and there's so many different definitions. There's at least like 5 or
Yeah.
6 definitions of gender out there. So I usually just ask people, it's like, well, what do you mean when you say gender? And then I ask myself, does that conflict with what I know about the biology of sex? Are they conflating with sex? And if it's not, I can usually just go ahead and use their definition, as long as we're
Interesting. So
dealing with
this could be another
concepts.
this could be another example, and I don't mean to be overly reductive, but this could be another example of like what I might consider just a semantic disagreement. Because if you ultimately approve and support and respect and honor someone's wishes to be referred to as a woman or a man or whatever, then then maybe you're not in disagreement when someone says, if someone says I was born a man and now but my gender is a woman and I identify as a woman, and if you say, okay, you identify as a woman, I'm going to call you a woman, then you and that person are not in disagreement about what they're referred to as. And it might be a semantic argument whether they want to, whether you accept that their gender is a woman, because if you're accepting that they refer to themselves as a woman, then there's not a material disagreement, I think. Am I right?
I wouldn't say that they're women, like a man who identifies as a woman. I would respect
You'd call them a woman. Because just like you said earlier,
well,
right?
if they're my friends, I would use their preferred pronouns.
Yeah.
I
But
wouldn't. I don't know a situation when I would calling, like, I've never called my friend Sarah Higdon a woman. Like, I use Sarah's preferred pronouns, but I don't. I don't think Sarah is a woman. I don't think I would call Sarah a woman. But I would respect her right to dress the way she chooses in public, and it's not going to affect our friendship or anything like that. I don't think Sarah should be competing in women's sports or anything like that, but I might be like, what are you doing here? But yeah, so I don't think trans women are actually women, and I wouldn't refer to them as such. But I would, if we're out getting drinks or whatever, I'm not just going to be like, they're going to call you this because I care about reality. It's just like, well, my friends, they get special treatment. I'll respect people who are in my circle. If I'm in a court of law though, and I'm testifying, I would probably stay strict to sex-based pronouns, because I think it matters to be really strict, especially if there's a case dealing about, well, what is sex? What does it refer to? Certain contexts, I would be much more strict. I wouldn't refer to children by their preferred pronouns, because I think a lot of them are ideological, and they're actually delusional with the gender ideology about what they are, and I think it could potentially lead to harm. So it depends. It depends on the context, I suppose.
So what's your view on gender then? Like do you think gender is not real, or what do you think
It
What do you think?
depends what
Depends
you
what they
mean
mean
by
by
gender. Yeah. If by gender you just mean the degree to which someone adheres to stereotypes associated with their sex or whatever, or these social stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, then yeah, gender is real. Like,
yeah.
people have varying degrees of, people like to express themselves in different ways. And David Bowie liked to, people would say he's non-binary today, but back then this was just a gender non-conforming male who just, wore makeup. And Boy George and all this stuff. Like, I guess people would say they're playing with gender. And I'm fine with people who do that. I don't think this is about identity. This is just about, there's a lot of people are complex. People have varied personalities. They have varying ways they want to express themselves. And sometimes you'll get males who want to express themselves in really feminine ways and females who want to express themselves in masculine ways.
And what's wrong with referring to, when you say feminine ways, masculine ways, you're half a step away from just saying, well, their gender, like you're comfortable saying masculine ways and feminine ways. Like, look, what's the issue with it? We see biological sex, like you mentioned, as referring to physical characteristics. Why can't we then look at, use the notion of gender, or use another word if you want, to refer to that social and cultural concept that relates to like the roles, the behaviors, the identities. Like if someone is male biologically, but I forget what word you use, but like they act or they feel more aligned with like characteristics
feminine
typically found in women.
Feminine
social roles. Like what is the problem with taking that half step and saying, okay, so they have more feminine roles. If they want to say their gender is more feminine, it feels like a semantic difference.
Yeah, no, I think we need to bring back masculine and feminine when we're describing, people who are gender nonconforming or sex nonconforming. I have no problem with saying that this is a very masculine woman. I have no problem saying that this is a very feminine man who can be more feminine than maybe most women who are out there. You can have extraordinarily feminine men and extraordinarily masculine women who are more masculine than I am. I think we need to bring back sort of this, because it shows that there is just sort of this bimodal variation in terms of the degree to which we conform to stereotypes, and this is an innate part of our personalities. Just as height, we wouldn't look at someone and say, oh, you have the height. I mean, people might say you have the height of a man if you're like a woman who's 6'3" or something, but no one thinks there's not like a man height and a woman height. You're just, some women are tall, some men are short. Same with masculinity and femininity. These are just personality traits, temperaments, these types of things. And
what's wrong with using the word gender as a synonym for like that?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It just depends on if that's what people mean and that's what they tell me they mean, then that's fine. But a lot of times they'll bring up, say gender identity, and like it's some innate trait that is then linked and can be mismatched with your sex or something. And then again, we're to the point where we have this sort of pseudoscience creeping in about like, oh, a masculine woman, there's something wrong with them. There's a mismatch in their body. There's a fundamental, something's off that can be fixed.
Well, we do know something's off that can be fixed, right? We do know, as you mentioned,
if you're just a masculine woman, some women are masculine and they don't think they're men. Right. They don't want to transition.
No, but for the people that can transition, like that, like there are, like we know that some people, if they want to transition, as an example, they can benefit by transitioning, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's something wrong with them. I would say that, they might, if they feel like they would benefit from taking certain steps, then they're free to do that. And I think for some people, it can actually make them feel better. But I would hesitate to say that like, oh, you actually have this fundamental mismatch. I would say that like you can feel that way, and it could be beneficial for some people to maybe make these changes for themselves, as long as they don't think that like, oh, there's the fundamental like mismatch in my body between my sex assigned at birth and my gender identity. It's just some people.
But the studies have shown that transgender individuals' brain structures in some areas more closely resemble the brain structures of the gender they identify with, rather than they're assigned.
That is not the case. So no, and I've done some pretty deep dives into all these studies. What they don't do is we know that from all these studies they've done when they did studies on sexuality, that people who are homosexual, like lesbians, and gay men, when you scan their brains, certain regions of their brains are more shifted towards the opposite sex. Most people who identify as trans are same-sex attracted, are homosexual. All these brain studies are doing is there's a confound of sexuality in these, sometimes to the degree where like, oh, we found like a 25% shift in trans people, and then you look and 25% of the people who were in their sample were homosexual, and they don't control for that. They don't control for sexuality in these studies. And when you do control for sexuality in the studies where they don't find this similar brain shift. So that brain shift is completely attributable to just the ones that happen to have a same-sex attraction. And then on top of that, like, even if it were the case that you can scan 1,000 people who identify as trans and have reference scans for the general population, you still find very, like, this is hypothetical, even if you found like a link between this doesn't mean that like you can't go the opposite direction and say that we're going to scan your brain, oh, you're trans because your brain looks like this. It's like a really big statistical thing. It'd be like saying that, height is heritable, and men and women have different heights, and therefore you can see like, oh, this person is 5'10". That means you're a man. Well, you could still have a woman who's 5'10" type of thing. And I don't know what that even matters. Even if there were a genetic component to like gender identity, as flawed as that concept is, I don't know what that gets you. It just says maybe there are certain reasons that people feel strongly that they might be the opposite sex, even if they're not literally. It's about as much as you could say.
Yeah, well, the reason would be it would kind of help make the case that, yeah, this person should really transition because they have the brain of a woman, even though they're a man. Yeah. Or they have the brain of a man, even though they're a woman.
For all I know, the only regions of the brain, and I don't know the name of it because I haven't looked at it in a little while, but there are differences in these big studies, but it's these areas of the brain, and I'm not so well versed in like all the brain anatomy, but it's areas in the brain that you see that are larger in people who have like body self-perception images, like people who have like anorexia and things like that, people who have abdominophilia, who like feel like they shouldn't have certain limbs on their bodies, and that makes total sense that they might have this type of thing. But it's usually in these brain regions that are sort of like a mind body type of thing, and not that you're just you have a feminine brain and a male body type of thing.
Well, let me double click into this, and just to kind of come back to my original statement. So my statement was that there's a lot of studies and data supporting the claim that brain structures in transgender individuals often more closely align with their identified, what we're calling gender, rather than their assigned sex at birth. And I think, Colin, you're saying that those studies are bogus. And so this is another example where I have to ask again, like, is there a big conspiracy? Because how else do we explain? Let me just give me 30 seconds to just in 2011. You have the study, Sexual Differentiation of the Human Brain. That study found that brains of transgender women had structural similarities to cisgender women in areas like the bed nucleus of the, I'm not a neurosurgeon scientist here, but stria terminalis. There was another study in 2016. There was another study in 2018, in 2020, in 2021, in 20. I mean, these are, again, like examples. These are all in PubMed, by the way. So this is another example.
These aren't controlling for sexuality. And I have a list of all 50 of these studies that we've gone through and like tagged. Did they control for sexuality? No. Did they not?
What do you mean sexual? Wait, so you have 50 studies across time and space, right? Across different countries, across different years. And they all have the same conclusion. And
well, the ones that control for sexuality don't find that shift in the brain.
What do you mean by control for sexuality? Like, what does that mean exactly? I'm stupid.
Because so if there's a so you would control for a variable if it's highly correlated with another variable. Okay, so we know that sexuality, you can scan the brains of people who are straight versus people who are gay, same sex attracted versus opposite sex attracted, and lesbians, for instance, you scan enough of them, their brains tend to look in certain regions are shifted more towards the male end of what we would consider a male
Wait, so
typical
are we
brain.
saying the same thing? So, but the point is that you do have individuals who have brain structures that more closely represent fill in the blank, gender, sexuality, whatever you want. I think
it's sexuality is what they're linking. So when they say that, oh, we're doing this for trans people, the thing is that most trans people are same-sex attracted. So if you don't just control for sexuality, if you're just lumping them all in there, you'll get the same result you'd get for sexuality.
So when you control for sexuality, so do you have this? So if I'm looking, okay, so you tell me. So if I'm looking at a study with men exclusively, so people who are born biological male, are you saying that if a gay man's brain structure is the same as a person who was born, a trans person who was born man and wants to transition to a woman, that there's no difference between the gay man and the trans woman? Is that what you're saying?
If the trans woman is attracted to men, then they would both be homosexual males, and their brains aren't any difference.
So you're saying there's no difference between let me be specific with my terminology here. There's no difference between, if we take thousands and thousands of people who were biologically born male and either transitioned or wanted to transition to female, you're saying there's no difference in their brain structures from a homosexual man.
It's not different in that it's shifted towards the sex that they identify with. There are those regions I mentioned about, like, sort of the mind body mismatch type thing that you get with people who have eating disorders and things like that, where they perceive themselves as being obese if they're not, or they perceive themselves as shouldn't be having certain limbs and that type of stuff. But when you we would need to see that this shift also occurs in people who are identifying as the opposite sex, who are opposite sex attracted, because if not, you're just recreating the results from studies of scanning people who are same sex attracted.
Wait, sorry, simplify it for me, the layman. So, is there a difference in brain structure between? So when you say control for sexuality, so if we look at homosexual males versus trans males. So males want to transition out of being a biological male. Are there difference in the brain structure of those people?
Not if they are both same-sex attracted.
So no, there's right. So so let me be more specific. So homosexual males versus people who are born male transitioning to female who are attracted to males. You're saying there's no difference in brain structure between those two groups of people?
Correct.
And the same would go for the reverse for females.
Yeah.
Remarkable that all 50 of these studies would not account for that?
Some do control for it, and they don't find the shift in the brains the same way the ones that aren't controlling for it.
I'd have to dig deeper into this, because why would you have? I don't know if this is a rhetorical question or not, but why would you have 50 studies from across time and space, from across different countries over different years, concluding that trans people have different brain structures if they know that? I'll have to dig deeper into this because I don't know the answer, but it would be hard for me to believe that there's a giant conspiracy, is what I'll say.
I would say this is a extraordinarily politically wrought topic, and you would be shocked to see the amount of corruption that's going on in some of these organizations, specifically with. So why would they want to have some biological link, no matter how light and tenuous? This has to do with civil rights law, because in order to have a protected category, you need to identify and have it linked to an immutable trait. Okay, and so you just have a couple activists, or even if just ignorant scientists who just we just didn't control for sexuality. It doesn't matter. These cases, these studies still get cited in court cases, because you get a lot of these ACLU lawyers who are just dyed-in-the-wool activists on this topic, and they'll try to fluster a judge by looking like, we have these 20 studies that show this shift in the brains. The judge doesn't know about the whole literature on the brain shift.
Actually, can I ask a question I just thought of? But let's say you're right that when you control for sexuality, but doesn't that still say something very fundamental? Why does that negate the study? So if I'm a trans woman and I have the same brain structure as a homosexual man, isn't that still important? Like, doesn't that still say something? And doesn't that still matter?
I mean, it says something about the origin of homosexuality and why some people might tend to be more same-sex attracted versus, and it's not even just same-sex, it's also gender nonconformity on a wider scale, because people who are same-sex attracted tend to be more gender nonconforming in other areas. They tend to be, gay men tend to have more feminine expression and feminine interests and jobs and things like that, and vice versa for lesbians. And there are basically like two pathways that have been identified for people who identify as trans. There's like the homosexual transsexual trajectory, which is, extraordinarily feminine men who come to identify as the opposite sex. Sometimes because they're so extraordinarily feminine that they just feel maybe so out of place in the world because holy crap, this is like one of the most feminine men you've ever seen, and some of them choose to transition. But then there's this other cohort of individuals who men who identify as women. It's called the autogynephilia route, where it has nothing to do with them being feminine or having this female gender identity. It has to do with it's a type of paraphilia. Basically it's an arousal at the thought of themselves as a woman, and this sort of gets conflated in their minds with being a woman or feeling like a woman, because it's an arousal they get, and that is another area. But those individuals tend to come out as trans much later in life, usually after they've had children in straight relationships, and they are heterosexual. They're not homosexual.
I did just find a study in PubMed from 2019 called "Brain Structure in Gender Dysphoria: A Review," and this does show that transgender individuals show brain structure patterns. This does distinguish between. This shows differences independent of sexual orientation. I could send you the study, but this is what it claims to show: that independent of sexual orientation.
There are some differences. I would just, the ones I have in my list, they're not along the line of feminine brains, and it's not along a masculine feminine axis. It's those regions that are associated with sort of body mind mismatch, that type of thing.
Got it. Well, Colin, this was great, man. Those are all my interrogation questions that I have for you. I appreciate you.
Hope people think I'm not a big scary transphobe after this. Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, I'm also not an expert on the topic, so I'm not able to fully push back on some of these things, even though I'm trying to, because I'm just ignorant.
No, you do. I appreciate the good faith pushback, because it's always good to sharpen your own blade, I guess, against.
And I believe that it sounds like you have trans friends and respect for trans people, and you want to refer to them the way they want to be referred to. And you're not, this is not, I don't think, an ideological, I'm not
religious.
Dogmatic,
I'm not coming at it. I'm not coming at it from a Matt Walsh, like, bend me to be men. And,
that's a whole
be a masculine. That's a whole other thing. Like I treat people as individuals. I want people to be able to express themselves as individuals, and especially for kids not to think something's wrong with them because they happen to be sex nonconforming. It's just like, be a feminine boy, be a masculine girl. Like, I thought we were moving that way and embracing that, and then all of a sudden this gender ideology came along, and it was just like, actually, you're
I'm sorry,
born in the wrong body.
I hope this is not that stupid of a point that I'm making. I do believe that some of the argument is semantic, because if someone's okay saying I'm a feminine man, if that person wants to say, okay, my gender is a woman, and what they mean by that is I'm a feminine man, they don't want to attribute any different additional rights or privileges, then I think in essence we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, if that's what they mean, but
right, if that's what they mean.
But I tend to interrogate people, and they mean something much more fundamental and a little woo-woo than I just happen to identify with a stereotype that's associated with being women. So,
what would that woo-woo thing they believe? Like, what do you mean? What do you think they?
It's the sort of innate gender identity, that this is an actual trait that people have, rather than I think gender identity.
What's the difference in implication? Like, what's the difference? I don't get it.
Well, it's not an actual it's not an actual trait. It's just something that people come to. It has a time and space in history.
I'm a basketball fan. I'm a New York Mets fan. That's
yeah, well,
a trait.
that's
You know,
it's not an innate trait though. It's just,
What's the distinction?
I'm a Kings fan because I grew up in Sacramento.
Yeah. So it's your
not
trait.
innate,
You're a
but
Kings fan.
but I have
What's the
some
distinction?
friends who grew up in Sacramento and they're Dallas Mavericks fans, the bastards, and
Yeah.
it's you're not born with this trait. It's not something that is fundamental to you. It's not like skin color. It's not like inheriting a genetic disease or something. It's just I'm a biologist. Is that an innate trait? It's a truth about me, but I could have easily been gotten to
what I guess I don't know if it's a philosophical question, like what makes something innate. Like if I have ADD, is that innate?
You get issues with categorization. I'd say that like it's innate in the sense that you have like these certain symptoms of inability to maintain attention on certain things. When there's clusters of these that we've called ADHD, but then there's the clustering of mental illness is really difficult because you can kind of draw clusters differently. There's a lot of overlap between related things. I would say that what people are just calling gender identity is this just their self-perception of how they see themselves as conforming or not conforming to social stereotypes. That is the innate trait. The innate trait is your degree of how masculine and feminine you are,
right?
Not your gender identity. You might
we're saying the same
someone
thing.
who's
if it's innate for me to be feminine, then there we go. We're on the same page. You can innately be seem like a different sex, gender, whatever.
So
like
if that's what you're saying, if all you mean when you say that, like, oh, my gender identity is a woman, it means that, like, oh, I just recognize that my sort of mannerisms and temperament and interests are more closely aligned to feminine stereotypes, then I have no problem with that. Like, but
so what's the distinction? Sorry, what could someone mean that you would disagree with then?
That I am a woman if I'm actually a male, or I'm a girl on the inside for real. This is an aspect of this is what makes me a girl, is the fact that I have a girl brain, and that this means there's a fundamental mismatch in my body between my gender identity and my sex assigned at birth. To me, that is introducing.
So I'm going in circles, but wait. But you do agree with that someone could have a mismatch between how they feel, like if they were meant to be a woman and they were born a man, and you believe, because I think you said this, that there are people who should transition, who are male, and they should transition to female because, right?
Some people
don't put words in your mouth.
Yeah, sorry. Some people feel an inherent mismatch in their bodies, like the Buck Angels, who just like crawling out of their skin because they feel this way.
Yes.
I wouldn't say that there is a mismatch. I say they feel this way.
What's the difference? I don't understand the difference.
Because you would otherwise,
if your neurology is telling you something's wrong, like that's in your brain.
Yeah, but for a lot of people if they're just sex nonconforming, that doesn't mean that your brain is telling you things that are wrong. It's just I'm just a masculine girl or a feminine boy.
Some people have a trans brain and they should transition, and they do, and they're happier, and you're friends with those people, right?
Some people, on top of the fact that they are sex non-conforming, also want to take steps to change their bodies because they think it would ameliorate their anxiety or their depression or their stress. And for some people that would, but then for some people who just grow up to be happy sex non-conforming adults, and there's nothing actually wrong with them. We're telling people that who are sex non-conforming that you have a mismatch, when that's not the case. Regardless if they feel anxiety from that. So a lot of people distinguish between gender dysphoria and being trans. So you can now be trans without having dysphoria. But I think it's still fundamentally wrong to tell a kid who's just sort of sex non-conforming that means who doesn't don't any idea that they wanted to transition, that you still have a mismatch between your gender identity and your sex. But if you ever want to fix that, that disparity, we can do that. I would just say that that's just natural human variation. You have masculine girls and feminine boys, and there's nothing
But
necessarily
there are
wrong with
people
that.
where there are trans people where there is a mismatch, right?
They feel to such a high degree that there is one that to them they take steps to fix that anxiety, and I think it can help some people.
I might be taking us in circles because I thought I thought I had understood your position, and now I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but and we're out of time, but yeah, thank you so much. Let
me try one more thing. Like,
sure.
Oh God, I might have just lost my train of thought. So I think being trans isn't something that you are born with. It's something that you do. And this is something that Buck Angel and Brianna would, they agree with me on this. They're like, I didn't become, like Brianna would say that, she had gender dysphoria when she was young and decided to transition and become a trans woman, where in Buck Angel too had gender dysphoria as a girl and then decided to transition and thereby became a trans man. But you're not born trans. You're born with whatever innate proclivities you happen to have, and transitioning is something you choose to do. It's an action that you take your body down a certain pathway with hormones and surgeries to move through the society as someone who's treated as the opposite sex. That's, if that helps. So it's this innate gender identity that I try to move away, because this gets people on the hunt for, got to find the trans kid who's out there, where it's just like, well, to me, there's no such thing as a trans kid. There's kids who may or may not have gender dysphoria that may or may not resolve, and we shouldn't be like labeling these kids with these traits that are not innate, because that is maybe putting them on a pathway to certain sort of medical interventions that they're not going to need, or they're most likely not going to need. So hope that helps clarify.
No, I have. Let's do a part 2. I have more questions. I gotta jump. Let me end this recording, and then thank you so much for your time. This is great.
Yeah, no, let's
catch up.
Thanks for doing it. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's catch up for a couple minutes. Let me just end this thing.